s'more? S'more what? No, you want a s'more. I haven't had anything yet, so how can I have some more of nothing? Shut up! You're killing me, Smalls.
What a classic movie clip. Welcome to Flynndogg Woodwork. Well, summer's coming to an end, and that means a lot of the things that we used to do in the summer are also coming to an end. But that doesn't have to be the case. Today, I've got an amazing gift idea that can keep summer running all winter long. So obviously, you can probably guess from my size, one of my favorite things to do in the summer is to eat.
Is he big?
Super big.
And there's no more classic summer treat than the s'more. So I was trying to come up with a way to keep this amazing summer treat going all winter long. And that's when I decided to Pinterest deep. And while Pinteresting deep, I found a couple of ways that we can make this amazing treat inside our home. Another thing that I noticed is these things are expensive. A lot of these s'more kits are going for as much as $200. So if you're interested in making a profit off of this item, I think this might be a good idea. And the nice thing about this project is you can make it any way that you want. In fact, right now, I've got no roadmap for this kit.
Sounds about right.
But I do have an idea of what we're gonna need. So let's go check that out. So first off, we're going to need the ingredients for s'mores. Here I have some graham crackers, some marshmallows, as well as chocolates. And if you haven't tried a s'more with Reese's, you gotta give it a shot. I also have 2 mason jars, 2 candles, some bamboo skewers, as well as some scrap hardwood flooring. For this project, I have no idea what the dimensions will be, so we're gonna be using a lot of referential measurements so that we can figure out exactly where to cut our wood. Before we do that, however, we need to figure out how we're going to lay out this s'mores kit. So what I've done here is laid out 3 of the larger pieces of flooring, and this will be the base of our s'mores kit. Once we have the base of this figured out, we can now begin to place the items that will go with this kit. And I want the candles in the very center. Along with that, I want the 2 mason jars on either side of those candles. Next up comes the chocolate, and I think we'll put chocolate in one corner as well as the other corner. After that, we can add the marshmallows as well as the graham crackers. Now the skewers will eventually go in these mason jars, so we can put those to the side for now. Now that we have everything laid out, let's talk about how we're going to clean up this hardwood flooring. Now just like with most hardwood flooring, you have a smooth side on one side and then a rib side on the other.
For your pleasure.
Now I want to clean up this rib side as well as some of these notches on the side. So we'll go over to the planer and clean up each one of these boards. So I'm just going to make a couple of passes on the rib side to get those flattened out. Now that I've sent this wood through the planer, you can see both sides are completely flat. However, on the edges, we still have this little rib and the little notch on the side. So I want to take this over to the table saw and slice off those edges. Now I will keep 3 of the pieces of wood with the tongue and groove because once these are put together, they're as good as jointed. So I'm going to leave the bottom with that tongue and groove. But for the rest of the pieces, I'm going to clean up the edges. Now that we have the tongue removed, it's now time to go to the opposite side and remove the groove.
Groovy, baby!
So now that we have most of the pieces cleaned up, it's now time to go back to the bottom. And now what I want to do is to glue this up so that we can clean this up later on. So I'm just going to add a little bit of Titebond 2 to each one of these seams and clamp it all together.
That's 3.
Now you'll notice I added a caul to the very center of this glue up as well as clamps on each one of the seams, and that's because it was bowing a little bit. So if you're working with flooring, you may need to do the same thing. So I'm going to let this glue up cure up overnight, and then we'll come back tomorrow and clean it all up. So it's the next day, and I've let that glue set up overnight. So I'm going to take the clamps off this panel, and then we can clean it up. So now, just like we did with each one of those individual wood pieces, I'm going to cut off those tongue and grooves and make this thing nice and flat. Now that we have the tongue and the groove cut off on both sides of this panel, I now want to focus on the end. And what we're going to do now is just square this up and remove that tongue and groove. Now ideally I'd use my cross-cut sled for this, but it's still in storage. So I'm just going to use my miter gauge and make sure it's set exactly at 90 degrees. Now that I have my bottom panel completely cut out, let's go back to the assembly table and take a look at what's next. So what I'm going to do now is to start to create the structure of the tray. So if I take one of the side panels and place it outside that bottom panel, it's just a little bit tall. And I want this tray to be just a little bit shallower. So I'm going to rip this side panel in half. And in this case, this panel is 4 3/4 of an inch wide. So I'm going to rip it down to 2 1/4. Now that I have the side panels ripped down to the appropriate height, I can now place it alongside that bottom panel so that we can cut it down to the appropriate length. And to do this, I'm just going to take a referential measurement and strike a line at both sides of those side panels. Then it's just a matter of cutting them down to size over at the miter saw. So now that I have the side rails cut to length, I now want to work on the end rails. So let's go over to the tray and take a look. So here you can see those 2 side pieces. Now I want to work on these end pieces, but first we need to cut them down to size. So I'm going to use the referential measurements once again and strike lines on the boards.
Oh, I get it. The whole self-referential thing.
And just like before, I'll cut these down over at the miter saw. So here's a look at what we have so far. And of course, this doesn't look very good with these blocky ends. And that's what we're going to fix up next. So what I first want to do is once again get a referential measurement on the top of the side rails on the end rails. Now, although it may be a little bit difficult to see, I have my 2 markings and I want to connect those 2 markings, so I'll just use a T-square and connect the 2 lines. Now comes the artistic part.
I'm an artist, you understand that? An artist!
And this is where I want to make a handle on either side of this tray so that we can carry it around. So I'm just going to play around with a couple of round objects and make those handles. So after a bunch of trial and error, this is the final design that I decided to go with. So what I'm going to do is to take both pieces and double side tape them together, and then I can go over to the bandsaw. And the nice thing about using double-sided tape is you only need to make the cuts once for both sides. And for this, I'm just going to try to stay as close to those lines as possible without going over. So now that we have a rough layout of the exterior of our handles cut out, I now want to focus on the interior of those handles. And I want to do this while the 2 pieces of wood are still taped together. And that's because I want to hog out most of the waste with the drill press using a 1-inch Forstner bit. So I'll secure my pieces to the drill press table and begin to hog out that material. So after a lot of back and forth, I finally have a rough layout of the handle. While I still have these 2 pieces of wood together, I now want to focus on sanding them. And this is really going to be kind of a pain in the butt because I'm currently without my spindle and belt sander as well as my regular sanders. So I'm going to get to work on this and I'll join you back in about an hour. Well, that's about as good as we're gonna get from this reluctant hand sander.
He seems reluctant.
Now let's soften the interior of those handles over at the router table using a roundover bit. So what I'm gonna do now is separate the two pieces and do an 1/8 inch roundover on the interior of both of these handles. With the interiors rounded over, I now want to do the same thing on the top side of the handle on both sides. So let's do that next. And here you can see a little red hash mark on both sides at 2 inches from the ends. And that's where I'm going to start my roundover and end my roundover. With the two end handles finished, this thing is really starting to look like a tray. Now I want to start working on some of the dividers so that we can have our candles and our jars. And to do this, I'll once again use referential measurements. So I'll take one of the side pieces and place it right up against the edge of the scrap. Once everything's aligned, I can then strike a line down the length of the board. Once I have this, I can go to the miter saw and cut it down. And since I'll need a couple of dividers, I'm actually going to cut 2 boards at the same time. With those boards cut to size, you can see they fit nicely in between those 2 handles, but they're way too tall, so let's address that next. If we take a look at where the bottom of the handle comes in, it's just over 2 inches, so I'm going to rip these boards to 2 inches tall. And these 2 pieces still have those tongue and grooves, so I'll need to remove those as well. With the tongue and grooves removed, I'll now move my fence over to 2 inches and continue the rips. So if we go back to our tray, you can see that those dividers are much lower and look much better. Now let's work on the cross braces that will hold each one of these candles and jars in place. And I was able to get both of those long dividers out of one board, so I have 2 more boards, and that's what I'll be using for those cross dividers. So I just need to figure out how long these need to be. And if we look at the thickness between the jar and the candle's just a little bit thicker, maybe a 1/16 of an inch. So that's what we'll be using for our measurements. So I'll place 2 candles on either side and place a board in front of the candle and behind the candles. And then I'll take a measurement right in the center. And we're right at 3 7/8. And this doesn't have to be perfect, as you don't want those candles too tight to pull out. And I'm going to need 5 of those dividers. So let's go over to the miter saw, set up a stop block at 3 7/8 and make 5 of those pieces. So here I'll lower my saw blade, place a tape measure, and set a stop block at 3 7/8. And now it's just a matter of slicing and dicing.
Slice, dice, and serve on rice.
So I'm going to try to get as many of these pieces out of these 2 blocks of wood as I can. So here's a look at that tray after we add those little dividers that we just cut out. And you can see there's plenty of room for your fingers to go in those handles, and there's a little area here that you can put some matches or a lighter. So we're getting to the point where there's starting to be a lot of pieces to this tray, so I want to start assembling it. But before I do that, I want to sand down some of the areas that will be less accessible once we start to glue this up. So I'm going to sand down the bottom and the interiors of that tray. And I've got some odd grit sandpaper in my shop, so I'm going to start off with 100 grit and then go to 150, and that's going to about do it. With my interiors sanded, I now want to focus on attaching the rails to this tray. And to do that, I'm going to use wood glue, CA glue, screws, and plugs. Now this tray would probably be fine with just wood glue, but I'm going to add some CA glue to speed up the process. I'm also going to add some screws and then some plugs on the top of those screws to give it a little bit of character.
Lots of character.
So what I've done here is measured the thickness of the board, and that's 5/8. So I'm going to scribe a line on the entire perimeter of the tray at 5/16 of an inch. This is going to give us a guideline for where we can place our Forstner bit so that we can plug our screw holes. With all of those lines scribed out and markings for where I want to place those plugs, now I can go over to the drill press and drill out those 3/8 of an inch holes. So here I am over at the drill press and I've got my 3/8 of an inch Forstner bit installed. So what I'm going to do is go to each one of my markings and bore out that hole. And one thing I forgot to mention is I do have the depth of each one of these holes set so that they're all the same depth. So now that I have those holes drilled out, I'm going to apply some wood glue on the opposite side of each one of the side rails, and then we'll clamp it down. With our side rails now clamped in place, we can now do the same thing with the end rails. So while we let that glue set up, I now want to focus on the center area that's going to hold the candles and jars. So here I've set up all the rails so that everything fits. And what I'm going to do now is label each one of these center rails as 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Once I have them all numbered, I now want to glue in our first rail using CA glue and wood glue. So I'll move the other rails to the side for the moment, and then I'll take my first rail and dot it with CA glue and wood glue. Once I have the first rail in place, I now can place my mason jar and repeat the process going from mason jar to candle. Once I have all those rails initially in place, I now want to take some clamps and make sure everything's nice and secure. So after letting everything set up overnight, I now want to take it out of clamps. Now with everything out of clamps, you can see how this is coming together. Now one thing I did do was I did glue this frame to the bottom of the tray. Next up, I want to create some dividers so that these chocolates can stay in place. One for the Reese's as well as one for the Hershey's. And for this, I'm once again going to use referential measurements. By placing a piece of the scrap wood right up against the center, I can go underneath and scribe a line on that wood. And I'll do the same thing on the side with the Reese's. With both of those pieces marked out, I can now cut them down to size. And here you can see how nicely those fit into place. Now you'll notice that there's a little bit of an overhang here. So what I'm going to do is take my pencil and once again strike a line at a referential measurement. Then I'll carry that measurement to the adjacent side. Once I've done that, I can connect this point to the corner and then we can cut it down. Once I have my markings made, I can use my tapering jig to cut them down to size. So now that we have our two pieces cut to size where they don't overhang, I simply want to take some wood glue and CA glue and clamp these up. So in the same way we glued up those dividers, I'll simply rotate between wood glue and CA glue and put it into place. Well, we are just about done with this project before sanding and finishing, but there is one other detail that I'd like to add to this project that I think is going to really make it stand out. Now you may remember those little holes that we drilled earlier with the Forstner bit. What I'm going to do now is pre-drill pilot holes, put in a screw, and then put in one of these small walnut plugs. And I really think this is going to make our end product stand out. Now, a lot of those screws are going into end grain, so they're not going to provide a whole lot of support, but they're going to look really nice.
They're nice.
Now that I have all those screws and plugs in, it's just a matter of sanding this thing down before we put some finish on it. So I spent about an hour doing a lot of hand sanding. Now that everything's cleaned up, let's add some Danish oil and finish this project up. And to apply this Danish oil, I'm just going to use a shop dowel. And this is where those walnut dowels are really going to pop. Now that we have some finish on this tray, this thing really looks great. Let's take a closer look. I really like that contrasting color of those walnut plugs. It really brings out a lot of character for this tray. And most of all, I really like all the storage that's perfect for what we're going to use this thing for. And that, of course, is loading this thing up with summertime goodies. Or maybe we should call them winter goodies now. Well, thanks for joining me on this simple build, which makes a great gift idea. If you haven't already, make sure you hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and leave a comment, as it really does help out this small woodworking channel. Until next time, take care as always.